Well, colleagues, unless anyone has any concerns, we might kick our International Women's Day event off. Good morning, everybody, and a very, very warm welcome for everyone that's joining us in the room today to be able to celebrate at Australia's Parliament House the events that we're doing for International Women's Day. My name's Nicola Hinder. I'm Acting Deputy Secretary at the moment for the Department of Parliamentary Services. It is an immense pleasure to be able to be here today, and an absolutely immense pleasure to be able to be here amongst such an outstanding group of women. Before we kick our processes off though, I'd like to invite Selina Walker, an Indigenous elder and also an Indigenous Australian and also an emerging elder who's going to welcome us to country.
Thank you. Yuma, Galagani Angelina Walker. Hello, my name is Selina Walker and this is Ngunnawal Country. I just want to first start by acknowledging my elders, the Ngunnawal elders, and pay respect to my elders past, present and future. I'd also like to acknowledge the recent passing of my grandmother, Auntie Agnes Shea, who was the most senior Ngunnawal elder here. She was a little old black woman, but she did get around, so I'm sure many of you crossed paths. If you did, you're one of the lucky ones. I'd also like to acknowledge any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are with us here this morning. Welcome my brothers, sisters, aunts and uncles. And I'd like to extend that to all of our non-Indigenous friends that have joined us. Welcome. The Ngunnawal community are the traditional custodians of Canberra and the region. You may not be aware that the Ngunnawal nation is made up of several family groups and not just individuals who represent this country. Therefore, as a community, we have an elected body known as the United Ngunnawal Elders Council to represent us, along with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elected body of the ACT. It is important for you to understand and acknowledge, for our identity is a collective identity. There are other Indigenous and non-Indigenous people from around the nation, the country and the world who have come to live on Ngunnawal land. I'd like to acknowledge and welcome you all. The tradition of welcoming the people to country is a practice that was handed down by our ancestors, old people and elders from the beginning of time. Before entering another person's country, you would first announce your arrival and not enter until the traditional owner formally welcomed you. The reason for this practice was to protect your spirit whilst in another person's country and also to show respect for the country which you're entering. It's wonderful to see this practice is now recognised and respected. I suppose it's not like entering into someone's home unless you're first invited. The Ngunnawal people, as within all Aboriginal people, have a great heritage that we would like to share with all Australians from every walk of life. As you are aware, Canberra means meeting place, and Canberra has been a place of gathering for many Aboriginal tribes of Australia to come together to deal with important business and also for ceremonial purposes. Our Ngunnawal ancestors believe in the importance of people gathering to build relationships, share knowledge and to celebrate the gift of heritage and history. We believe it's important for all to recognise our unique history and to gain an understanding that our land is our heritage and how loss of the land has disconnected so many Aboriginal people from their spiritual links, cultural heritage and identity. Reconciliation is not just a word, it is an action, and it's a human rights movement. As an Aboriginal person in this country, I've only been counted as a human being for 58 years. Let me repeat this while this sinks in. I, as a beautiful black woman in Australia, have only been counted as a human being for 58 years. I'm only 44. We're very young in our reconciliation journey here in Australia, but we're on the right path. By incorporating proper cultural protocols like welcome to country, acknowledgement of country, smoking ceremonies, etc., we are on the road to true reconciliation. It does still hurt me though that my dad was born a tree, that my grandmother was a mother in this country before she was a human being. So I ask you all to take a moment and think about how old you are, how old your children are, and how old your elders are, and what you're doing to contribute to that reconciliation human rights movement. The referendum that happened last year, 2 years ago now, was another huge milestone in our reconciliation journey. Not the result that we wanted, but it did bring a lot of truth-telling. Helped us to identify where we have to focus our efforts and what states need the most amount of help. I'm so proud to be a Canberran. I'm proud of my fellow Canberrans for the yes vote here in the ACT. Still a lot of work to be done, but it's a demonstration that the work that my grandmother and many other elders have done towards reconciliation can influence that change that we all want. Remembering that vote was not a vote for me to be Aboriginal. It was not a vote for me to be a traditional owner. It was a vote to edit a document, and that's what Australia said no to. So we'll recalibrate, we'll reassess, we'll find another way forward to continue to fight for First Nations justice that's going to work for all Australians. I stand on the shoulders of giants and I want to honour those giants. It is a shared history, so there has to be shared accountability. If we continue to live in shame here in Australia, we are never going to progress forward. I don't want my boys to be standing up here in 20, 30 years' time, fighting and advocating for the same things that I am today, that my grandmother's done for the past 60 years, my ancestors for the past 200 years. That change happens with us. So I encourage you all to continue to have those conversations, have those awkward discussions where learning and understanding, which is what true reconciliation actually is, lies. It lies in a simple yarn. So thank you for inviting me here to do the Welcome to Country. I'm excited that I'm on the panel and look forward to the discussions, and I commend the men that came. Well done to you for joining this great fight that we have. So in the words of my people, Yumalandi Yonanga Yerabu Yangu, which means you may leave footprints on our land now. In other words, welcome to country. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thanks very much, Selena. Colleagues, I'll note that's the second time that I've had the privilege of having Selena issue a Welcome to Country. Every time I hear it, Selena, I learn something new, and I'm incredibly struck by the power behind your words. So thank you for delivering them today. So colleagues, the theme of International Women's Day for 2025 by UN Australia is Marching Forward for All Women and Girls. 30 years ago, in 1995, the United Nations organised the 4th Global Women's Conference in Beijing. 189 countries gathered to sign the Beijing Declaration and the plan of action that was a really bold, for its time, call for gender equality. It set out 12 critical points of concern, providing a gendered perspective on things like poverty, education and training, health, violence, armed conflict, the economy, power, decision-making, institutional mechanisms, all for the advancement of women, all human rights, the media, environment, and for the girl child. There has been a huge amount of progress made since that time, and we know, though, very sadly, that 30 years on, no one country has fully implemented the plan of action in full, and there are lots of promises that remain unfulfilled for millions of women around the world. There has also not been another world or global conference for fears of slippage of the standards that were achieved in Beijing. That's 30 years on. Today, though, we're really hoping that through conversation we're going to reflect on history, personal and political shapes, momentums for change, and how important it is for us all to look back in order to march forward. And all 4 panellists that you're going to hear from today, and I'm very humbled to be sitting at the end of them, quite honestly, have committed to promoting the achievements of women, to challenge women's historical underrepresentation in a myriad of ways. And so with that, I'm going to give you an insight into who these fabulous women are today, starting with Alison Alder, who's a visual artist whose work blends studio practice with social and political themes, focusing on empowering communities and highlighting underrepresented histories. In 2023, Alison was named the inaugural Artist in Residence at Australian Parliament House, where she researched and created a new body of work focused on the campaign to achieve full suffrage for Australian women. And Alison is also the artist that's responsible for the I Am a New Woman display at Parliament House, and also whose work has been highlighted on the exterior of Parliament House as part of the I Am a New Woman representation happening for Enlighten. If you haven't seen it, please do. It's just magnificent. Clare Wright, to my left, is an award-winning historian, author, broadcaster and public commentator. She's currently Professor of History and Public Engagement at Trobe University and serves as the Chair for the National Museum of Australia Council. In recognition of her contributions to literature and historical research, Clare was awarded a Medal of the Order of Australia in 2020. Helen McCabe is a journalist, magazine editor and digital media executive. She's the editor-in-chief of the Australian Women's Weekly, which, I mean, seriously, people, for women of my generation, you never had without a copy of the AWW in the loo, sorry. Deputy editor of the Sunday Telegraph, and has spent over a decade in television before founding Future Women in 2018, a platform dedicated to empowering and elevating all women's voices. Helen also hosts FW Weekly Leadership Series podcast, highlighting the big achievements of all women. And I've already introduced Selena, but to provide you with some more context into the wonderful work that she does, she's dedicated to supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in the ACT. She was named the ACT's Local Hero in 2024, and since 2018 has co-chaired the ACT Reconciliation Council. She's also a co-founder of the Yerrabbi Yerwang Child and Family Aboriginal Corporation and does magnificent work advocating for Indigenous people in the Australian justice system. So when I say I'm very humble for sitting amongst a group of such magnificent women, it's a genuine appreciation. So opening it up, because I know there's lots of questions that we're all going to have to be able to ask these fantastic panellists. I'm going to lead some panel discussions, and then I'm going to hand over to one of our local DPS officers to be able to lead questions that are coming from the audience. And the last bit that you'll hear from me, other than the questions, is just a simple apology. At 12 o'clock today, I need to step out. Unfortunately, I'm undertaking interviews this afternoon for a key position for DPS, and so need to leave at about 12 o'clock. Right, so I'm going to start off with Alison. Alison, I've given you a little bit of a lead-in in relation to the artwork that you're delivering as artist-in-residence for APH. And your series of artworks at the moment that you've done are being projected onto the Parliament House facade as part of our contribution as a national cultural icon to the Enlightened Festival. And they're being broadcast alongside that anthemic anthem of Helen Reddy, which is I Am Woman. Perhaps, though, you'd like to be able to just give us an overview of how you chose those 12 women to highlight in your artwork, and what archives or other forms of information did you use to pick them?
Thank you so much. Well, it was quite a process. I had been working on a series of works about the first Australian Prime Ministers, and when I was researching that work, I was looking also at their wives, and I came across Margaret Fisher, Peggy as she was known, who was the wife of Andrew Fisher, the Prime Minister number 5, I think. And she was a great suffragist. And it sort of alerted me to that history that I realised I didn't know too much about. So I started reading, including Clare Wright's book, of course, and realised that it was actually a huge movement right across Australia. There were suffrage organisations and women's organisations working towards suffrage in every country town, every regional centre, and the metropolitan cities, of course. So it was a bit of a process to try and work out who to represent, as there were a lot of women involved. In the end, in conversation with Dr. Diane Herriot, who's in the audience today, we sort of thought it might be good to try and to narrow it down and represent each state, and then eventually the Northern Territory and the ACT as well. But of course, things were compounded by the fact that the history of women has not been recorded very well or kept in archives. So some women were not able to be included in the series. For example, Leontine Cooper, who was in Queensland. She was an amazing suffragist and activist for the rights of women, but I could find no photograph of her. So she was out of the picture. Some women's records, of course, were lost or destroyed by their families. So it's, as Claire would attest, I'm sure, with her research, it's quite a difficult issue to try and find adequate documentation to represent the women. So in the end, because I'm an artist and basically I'm selfish and I'm making the work for myself, I just chose the women who were of interest to me in the end, because their stories were so amazing, and it was also an issue of also trying to find their images and images that I could work with. So even people like Emma Miller, who did end up representing Queensland, her photograph is a really poor image that was published in a journal or a newspaper, very grainy. So I had to sort of use my skills to try and bring those images up to life. The same with Henrietta Dugdale, for example, her images were pretty shocking. But that was part of the challenge for me, to try and contemporise these images and make them interesting to new audiences, and hope that people might be encouraged to find out a little bit more. The archive searches were sort of quite different in some ways. So, one other thing with the women that I wanted to put on with the work, I should mention, is that they were all involved in lots of different women's organisations across the depth and breadth of the country. So I wanted to include those organisations, refer to those organisations in the artwork as well. So, for example, Vida Goldstein was, she belonged to, and I'm sure there were others, she belonged to the Women's Writers Club, the Victorian Women's Suffrage Society, the National Anti-Sweating League, the Women's Federal Political Association, the United Council for Women's Suffrage, the National Council of Women, plus others like the Women's Peace Army, and she published the Women's Voter and Women's Sphere. So like, these women were busy, they were committed. They're a very good role model for what we need to do now, I think, to keep supporting women in their lives, and also some of the issues that they were agitating over are still not resolved, like violence against women, for example, or gender equity in regards to pay. But the archives, so for the information, I just read as many books as I could find about the suffrage movement and those years. And then the image searches, where I was assisted by the Parliamentary Library, and thank you very much to the Parliamentary Library for supporting this project so fulsomely, were mainly the National Library, the state libraries of New South Wales, Queensland, Tasmania and Victoria, South Australian Museum, South Australian Library, National Archives. I think that's about it. So yeah, it was the image search that was the main focus for me, obviously, being a visual artist, and trying to find representation of those women and any sort of objects associated with them as well. Yeah, thank you.
Such an incredible piece of analysis to be able to highlight women in Australia who have made fundamental difference to everyone's life in Australia. But yet, to be honest with you, Alison, until I started to read the books that came out from your exhibition, I had no knowledge that they were there. And that's very sad, a sad representation for us all. Changing slightly though, Claire, so as an historian of women's history, can you tell us a little bit about your perspectives of looking at underrepresentation of women and women involvement, and what that actually teaches us about moving forward? So what sort of led you to start to tell women's stories, and what inspires you along that way?
Gosh, it's so long ago now, sort of back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, in terms of starting this. But I do want to make one point, actually, firstly, before I start it all. Selena, thank you for that welcome. Thank you for welcoming me onto country, and I acknowledge your ancestors and your leaders past and present, and it's very meaningful to have been welcomed with such generosity of spirit as you have to us today. Thank you. I like to say I don't write women's history. I've always said I don't write women's history. I write Australian political history with the women put back in. Yep. That's a very different thing. When I wrote The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka, my publishers at first wanted to call it The Lost Rebels of Eureka. And I said, those women weren't lost. We forgot them. To say that they were lost makes it sound like they were kind of the silly Sheilas in Picnic at Hanging Rock who went for a wander and never came back. The moral compass points very differently when we say we forgot them. And I know that really specifically because when I was doing that research, that book took me 10 years to research. And not because it was so difficult to find women, but quite the opposite, because once you had thrown away the myth that the goldfields were a place exclusively populated by men, and that Eureka was an event entirely dominated by men, the male miners and the male diggers. Once you washed away with that mythology and went back to the archives and recreated the story from the ground up, what I discovered was that women were a third of the Ballarat population. And they were involved in every single aspect of that event that came to be known as the birthplace of Australian democracy. And that has been studied in schools. You know, I studied in primary school, my kids have studied it in school, it still is now. It's central to the way that we understand the building of this nation. And the women themselves knew that they were being left out of that story. So Eureka happened in 1854. Basically, everybody wanted to forget about it for about 30 years because it was such a shambles and because the men were so humiliated and embarrassed and shamed that it had come to what it did, which included the death of a woman. Now, that death of that woman has now been recognised and commemorated in statuary around and commemorative plaques around Ballarat, but that didn't happen until after my book was published. But she was there, evidence of her death was there in a primary document by an eyewitness, attested to by an eyewitness on the day after, the 4th of December, in his diary, and generations of male historians had used that diary in their writing of the Eureka story and had just, I've got to say, just decided that that detail wasn't important enough to put in, or some way intervened in the story they wanted to tell if they acknowledged that a woman was killed. And the diary says the woman was killed defending the life of her husband and from the mounted troopers. So by 1884, when Eureka was being celebrated for the first, started to be commemorated for the first time by people like Henry Lawson writing poetry about it. Thank you for including Louisa Lawson in one of the women, his mother, and a staunch suffragist. Those women were writing to the newspapers saying, don't forget about us, we were there, this was our event too. We were on the ground, we fought for this, it was our blood that was spilled as well, because they could see what was happening in this nation-building poetry, in this moment when an Australian identity, a national identity was being built around events of the past. And they were actually writing these newspaper articles saying, don't forget about us. So there was no way I was going to let my publishers call this the lost rebels of Eureka. We forgot about them. And a bit like it's beholden, as Selina said, on all of us to participate in the act of reconciliation, to move forward together as a nation, to acknowledge the truths of the past. There's no point in, there's no point in moving into a house and seeing that the foundations are faulty and it's starting to slide into the ground and there's cracks appearing in the walls and on the ceilings, and saying, well, I didn't build the house. It's not my problem. I don't have to fix it. When you're actually the one that's going to be sucked into a suckhole of suckery. So again, I think it's beholden to not only female historians, but male historians, and thank you, Selina, for recognising the men who have come here together with us today, because this is not just a women, this is not, it might be called International Women's Day, but we all need to get behind all of the problems that still exist, particularly ones like domestic violence, particularly the pay gap, particularly because men still do dominate all the fields in which power is held. And we know that statistically. It might not feel like it if you're in the room. There's that statistic, you know, if a third of the room is filled with women, all the men say, it was all women. There were only women there. We know that across the board. It's not the case. And the suffragists couldn't have won the vote for women without men. Why? Because only men were in Parliament. Only men could put up the bills that we're going to only men could pass the bills. So women have always needed male allies. I hate the expression male champions for change, because it just implies to me that the bloke puts on a purple badge for the day and gets his personal assistant to organise the morning tea at his corporation. But there have always had to be men who have gotten behind women and so-called women's causes. But as Selina said, these aren't women's causes. These are human rights issues. These are not black issues. They're Australian issues. These are not women's issues. These are all of our issues. And so, you know, for me, it is beholden on anybody who sees that there has ever been an injustice to try to right that injustice. And to sort of come back to, I think, what was your question, I just started seeing that injustice at some point in my academic career, that my story wasn't being told. It never occurred to me when I was a child at primary school or high school, or even, to be honest, my undergraduate years, when I said, well, where am I in this story? I'm being taught it like it's all of our story, but I don't see myself reflected in it in any way. Is that the truth? Is that factual? Or is that just the way this story is being told? And so now when I go and speak to groups of school children, I say to them, don't think something hasn't happened just because you haven't learned about it in school. And don't think people who reflect who you are now, and this doesn't just go for women, this goes for queer people, this goes for people from what we might, you know, from multicultural, or I was thinking about Eureka, so I'm stumbling on my words. At the time it was called cosmopolitan, and we now would say multicultural or called or ethnic or whatever term we want to use for not white and Anglo-Saxon. That we all, it's beholden upon all of us to ask the stories, to ask the questions, and that's ultimately what history is, and is asking critical questions of inquiry, and then going back to the archives and seeing what the archives have to say about that question that you have asked. If you lead it the other way, if you go in with a determined idea or a philosophy or a point you're trying to prove, and then you go to the archives to find evidence to support your case, then you're writing polemic or a manifesto. You're not writing history. You make a very good lawyer, but you won't make a good historian. And all I've ever tried to do is be a good historian.
I often sit and reflect, and actually now that I've got children that are old enough to be able to have really grown-up conversations with them, throwing out these challenge-type questions to them about learning from things that we've seen, learning from things that have happened, and how they can actually apply those learnings going forward, right? It's such a valuable thing.
And it's the reason that I made Utopia Girls in the first place, which is the ABC documentary about how Australia became the first country in the world to win full political equality for women, for white women, the right to vote and the right to stand for Parliament. Before anybody says, that was New Zealand, Australia was the first country that also gave that right to stand for Parliament. And I originally pitched that idea to the ABC as a biodoc of Vida Goldstein, one of my great heroes of history. But they decided they couldn't do that because she lost all of the elections that she had stood for. So the fact that she was the first woman in the world to stand for elected Parliament didn't matter because she was a loser. And I kind of made the argument, well, what about Gallipoli? Like, we lost. And, Burke and Wills, well, they died. We seem to not mind backing and creating legends around men who have endeavoured to do something extraordinary but might not have made it. But when I came up with gave them the fact that it was the first country in the world, well, then line honours went to Australia. Woohoo, it's the America's Cup, we can go forward on this. But the real reason I made it was because I wanted young women who might take for granted their vote to understand that they only had that vote because these generations of women had fought for that in the first place. That we start to think that history is inevitable. History is never inevitable. History is only ever made by the choices that people make to stand up for what they believe is right.
So I think we're reflecting a little bit on that question of inevitability. The media is one of those things which is an inevitable amongst us as well, and we have an absolute giant of the media with us today. So Helen, the media was singled out in 1985 as a particular critical area of concern, with the Beijing platform finding that the media can play a significant role in both perpetuating and challenging social norms that condone discrimination or violence against women. So we know that things are changing, and they have changed, and things are now changing as well to showcase some absolutely incredible Australian and international women in media that challenge stereotypes, but women are still significantly underrepresented as media creators and as news subjects. What have you seen over the course of your career?
Thank you. And thank you everyone for having me here today. I have this extraordinary draw to Canberra. I was a reporter in the press gallery at the age of, I think, 21 or 22, which looking back now, you know, does seem insane. I was on the doors on the day we did the doors and came in every morning and had no idea what I was doing, which only reinforces the general public's view of journalists. But anyway, I'm still here. I'm still working in and around the political space and with both sides of politics, and certainly doing a lot in the policy space now, and the leadership space, which is fantastic. But one of the reasons I set up FW in 2018 was because I had worked in every medium, apart from book publishing at that stage. I've subsequently done a bit of that. That is the toughest thing of all time. And had worked for male leaders in every sphere, including magazines. 7 years as editor-in-chief of Women's Weekly, and I reported to men the whole time. The entire business was set up as a product for women, produced by women, and at the end of the day, I walked into the office of a man, often a guy who'd been really good at puzzles or beer or gyms, actually. There was a guy who was really good at gyms. And I remember one day he was pointing to a picture and he was going, what was he calling it? Eater. And of course it was Ita. And I just was like, I really didn't need a lecture on Ita Buttrose from a guy who couldn't pronounce her name. So one of the reasons for starting FW was because of that. Like, I was just absolutely fed up with every day going into work, and the idea of a story that might attract female readers was a very attractive white woman on a step in front of a beautiful house talking about childcare. And in fact, on the Sunday Telegraph, when I was deputy of the Sunday Telegraph, that was the recipe for the page 3 Sunday paper, was that woman on page 3. So I'd also worked in London for Murdoch when page 3 girls were quite different. But anyway, so I then went on to edit Women's Weekly, and there was 4 women that you could put on the cover. Tracy Grimshaw, Rebecca Gibney, anyone with it was royal, I'll just count them all as one, and Deborah Hutton. Mm-hmm. And literally that was as 12, we had to do 12 episodes a year, 12 episodes, 12 editions. I'm crossing my media platforms now. And anyone outside those 4 was regarded as risky. So without labouring it too much, I realised that there had to be a point in Australian media history that we would move from the printed product, the linear television product, into a world where women were members or subscribers of a product that was online. And I'm pleased to say today, FW is that product. But where we could find new voices and faces, and that they didn't have to fit a particular television newsreader appeal. We really admired, as a country, women that looked photogenic. And I'm grateful to say, in terms of changes, I've actually seen quite a significant shift. Multiple women have been premiers in this country and have done it authentically. And I think we have moved from a kind of an ideal view of what, and you remember all through Julia Gillard's prime ministership, the pressure on her appearance. So I think that has been a big shift. I think this has got 2 edges to it. One, there are a lot more women dominating, and they are older. When I finished in television, I was like 30, and I thought, that's it, career done, too old for TV. I probably spent more time in television in my 40s, not as a reporter, but in other roles. And I realised that's shifted. But then Lee Sales and Laura Tingle through the 2022 March for Justice rallies, I watched that every night. And acknowledging that there's a lot of commentary around the ABC and people have differing views about anyone that's on the ABC and reporting. I don't think those rallies would have been reported in any way the same way if there weren't 2 women hosting that show. And I could say that right across the platform, right across the sector. I do think women are having quite a significant influence finally in the choice of stories and the photographs, which was not happening at all in 2018. But I will make the final point that journalism's never been paid less. It's never looked less attractive to men. You can't find James Jessel. I love James Jessel. I hope this is Chatham House rules. He's now the editor-in-chief of the Financial Review. He's an incredibly talented bloke. He worked here for Joe Hockey and has done all the things. He stood down as publisher of all the Fairfax newspapers, and a woman was promoted. He went back as editor-in-chief of the Financial Review. That's the most profitable media brand in the country right now. So he cleverly chose the job. But the really big jobs are no longer that attractive anymore. Who would want to be editor-in-chief of the Daily Telegraph now? They're all struggling. So I do feel it's a bit like teaching. When all the women turned up to teach and started to get paid a lot less, men moved on with their lives. I feel like mainstream journalism is a bit like that. And I also will just extrapolate a little bit further. You're now seeing that across, like people will say, Coles, Myer, Woolworths, Qantas, Telstra, all CEOs are women. Fantastic, tick, brilliant. Except almost every one of those companies is structurally challenged. And the amazing woman that's heading up the Global Institute for Leadership over at the ANU, I interviewed her recently here in Canberra for the National Intelligence Community, and I asked, she was the pioneer of the glass cliff. And I actually put that to her. I said, I just watched Vanessa Hudson, although I think her results are really good this week. Let's talk about the CEO of Woolworths, for example, right on the front line of a business that's struggling, is at the glass cliff.
Mm. And that statistic came out yesterday that 75% of Australian employers still have a gender pay gap, and that pay gap is at least $25,000 a year. Women are. So this issue that the women who are portrayed in Alison's beautiful artwork out there we're fighting for is not only not getting better, it's getting worse.
Well, I've had reason to sort of think about the big moments, like what has shifted the dial. And in 2012, WGEA, which was Julia Gillard's legislation, which I remember when she said that, I was like, oh, what good is that going to be? Like, whoop-de-doo. Anyway, cut to today, under Mary Mental Brock, head of WGEA, Wooldridge. She has done an incredible job, actually, of a bit like Kate Jenkins, incrementally just doing the work from a legal framework to get the data to make the points. And so that legislation, the Respect at Work legislation, the positive duty legislation, and now the pay gap legislation and reporting, they are the things that are going to shift the dial.
It's that what gets measured gets managed.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the pay gap, in my world, I get these frantic phone calls from friends, men who go, just talk to me. Like, we do pay women the same amount. I'm like, no, you do, because it's illegal to not do that. Or mostly, you do. But that's not what we're talking about. They really struggled last year when it came out. And then now everyone's trying to work out how to get around it. So a friend of mine told me that in the legal profession, they just separated the entities. So the entities where all the women were doing the administrative work, so the less paid work, became a different legal entity in order to not make their results look bad. I don't know how widespread that is. Dan holding his head in his hand. So, there's a loophole, right? I'll find it. So there's a bit of that. But the fact is we're moving in a much better direction for just having the data.
You can't affect change unless you can actually be there, the one demonstrating the value of the change and having the data behind it. I think every time that we're looking at a problem and we're bringing it forward from, and this is entirely a personal reflection, from a gendered perspective, without actually having the data behind it to be able to substantiate it, we're never going to be able to bring forward cogent enough arguments to have everybody understand it without it just being a woman's issue, right?
I'll give you an example of that. So I started an organisation called A Monument of One's Own a few years ago, which is an advocacy body, completely volunteer run. We haven't got a cent to our names, dedicated to statue equality in Australia. And what we quickly realised is that there needed to be some statistics around that, because otherwise, basically, I think this goes for in a lot of situations, men just think it's women having a bit more of a whinge. But if you have the statistics, then people start to pay attention. And so, you know, the broad statistic is that there are only 3% of statues in Australia are of full-bodied named women, not allegorical women, like female forms who represent peace or justice, or but actual women who you can name who did something. There are more statues of animals in Australia than there are of women. There are more statues of birds in Sydney than there are of women. And then when we started, we did a voluntary survey of all the capital cities and of all the group of 8 universities to ask them how many statues of women they had on their campuses or in their cities, and then how many Indigenous women and how many Indigenous men, to get even more granular. And that was what allowed me to sit, again, Chatham House rules, in front of Sally Barnes at the National Capital Authority with Professor Kim Rubenstein, who's on my board. Was able to sit in front of Sally Barnes, knowing the answer to the question already, and saying, Sally, how many statues of women are there in the territory that National Capital Authority have the authority for? And she had to say 0.
And do you know the first female figure in the national capital, in the National Triangle, was John Gorton's dog,
Yep.
Ruby.
There you go.
Was the first female figure in the Parliamentary Triangle.
But having put that statistic, goes back to the data, having put that data directly to her, and I said, Sally, do you think that's good enough? It's 2022. It might have been 2021 there. And do you think do you think it's good enough? This is our national capital. It is a reflection of the achievements of women of this nation. And now we have Dame Edith and Dame Dorothy there, and Susan Ryan, and there's another one in the works, and we are now advocating, A Monument of One's Own is advocating for a statue of Catherine Helen Spence, kitty corner to Andrew Inglis Clark on Constitution Avenue, because Andrew Inglis Clark, known as the father of federation, famous for the Hare-Clark system of proportional representation, he and Catherine Helen Spence were contemporaries in their day, and in their day that system was known as the Hare-Spence system, because she actually invented that system of proportional representation. And John Stuart Mill, the father of democracy, he acknowledged Catherine. So in her day, her name was known. Again, these are the things that we forget. And so we're trying to get the same artist. We've got sign-off from the National Capital Authority and from the landowners. We're in the fundraising stage now. So if anybody wants to contribute to see a statue, kitty corner from Andrew Inglis Clark, with the two of them in conversation, taking up as much space in our city streets, because as you know, that's a huge statue. And it's by these things that I think, as you say, Helen, we start to move the dial on the conversations, and we start to let go of the kind of internalised narrative that women haven't done anything important in the past, and then therefore, of course, can't do anything important now, which is the same as when you have those female authority figures on your television screens. If you don't see them, well, it's the old saying, you can't be what you can't see.
Thinking about things that you can't see, and I'm going to have the last part of our panel discussion really focused on coming with Selena and the insights that she's going to be able to bring forward. Just one thing, Helen, that you said struck with me, which was the visual representation of Australian women in the media, or women in the media. And I often sit, and I used to think this was funny, but now I still think it's funny, and I sometimes think it's incredibly sad as well, but how brave it was of someone like Karl Stefanovic on the Today Show who wore the same suit every day for 365 days and not once had a viewer insight complaining about what he looked like or that he was wearing clothes that were inappropriate. And I look at the bravery of some of the men in the media about bringing that forward, because he said that he did that because of the amount of vitriol and abuse that his women co-leads were getting about what they were wearing and what they looked like, right? Now, that only happened about 2 or 3 years ago. Do you think it's still here now? What are we doing? How can we affect that change?
I think it's worth commenting on how bad it is for female presenters, journalists, presenters. I mean, Lisa Miller comes to mind on the ABC. I've known Lisa since we were both kids up here. Just a fundamentally good person, lovely, and to have her being trolled on Twitter every day for a whole bunch of reasons, that really came to the fore. And I remember ringing her at one point, and she said she was just dropped off Twitter, and she knew it was really bad when everyone keeps ringing, "Are you okay today?" She said, "Oh, what is Twitter doing to me today?" But they all, I mean, Annabel Crabb talks about it a bit. She's said she's worked out how to put it past her. Lee Sales, a bit the same. They're so in the public eye, but it's not just what you look like. It's violent. And I suspect there'll be an opportunity to talk about this at some point, but I do think the man discussion is the discussion we're going to have for the next 12 months, if not longer. You can wrap it up as D&I, you can wrap it up as gender. In Australia, I think D&I is gender. I think D&I in the US is more race. But I do think there is extreme undercurrents of misogyny that are fueling this, and certainly our lead female figures are under siege on it, and it is disgusting. You know, Carl, not so sure. Love him, but I don't know. Personally, I remember thinking about the political space and whether, you know, you would go into politics as a high-profile woman with or without children. That's tough. Often commented on particularly well by Annabel. And I think there was a period of time where you just wouldn't. Like, it was just too tough if you're a sensible. I think that's better to finish on a positive note. I think the sheer numbers of women coming through politics now, there is a network to support them. They get it. So it's better. I think it's better for the Claire O'Neills and the Penny Wongs and the Jane Humes, Zoe Mackenzies than it was 10 years ago. And I mention that because we're in for female presenters and for women generally out in public mounting an argument, whatever that argument might be, it's still pretty nasty.
Yep, that's not, and it's not the space we want to be in.
And can I just add one thing, that then try being a black woman in the public eye. I worked very closely with Megan Davis through the Voice campaign. And then once you add racism to misogyny, what she copped during that time is just disgusting. I left Twitter straight away after that campaign was over.
I left Twitter as well.
Because I couldn't countenance even being on that platform, having seen what she had to put herself up for day after day.
I think what's very sad about this is the truth-telling that needs to go into calling out some of these things as they're happening. And that's why I'm really, really glad that we're going to have the last part of the panel discussion today with Selena, because history and truth-telling are inherent parts of what we've spoken about in terms of the reconciliation process. Do you feel that there's been progress, though, in the telling of a First Nations perspective on Australian women's history?
Absolutely not. I think truth-telling in itself, like we're still not there, and I think that we've done enough truth-telling, to be honest. I think it's time for truth-listening.
Yes.
Because, 200 years my ancestors have been talking and been telling truth. And if you look at all the imagery kind of the history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, it's predominantly men. Like there's not a lot of photos of the women. The women were there as well, and trying to protect the kids. And, I feel very fortunate that, I come from a line, of strong black women and, who were nurturers, and true to themselves. And my great-grandmother was the local midwife, so she birthed a lot of the kids. And, then my grandmother took on that role. And, one of the things, like, my grandmother was so humble. And, it's interesting when we read out those bios, like, even now, it still makes me feel uncomfortable, and I don't highlight those things. And I think, why? Because then it leaves us open to ridicule, right? And, we should be proud of those things. We give children participation medals, and that's the best thing to them, but we don't take it on ourselves. And so I think, we need to do a bit more work in promoting ourselves as well. But my grandmother, she passed when she was 91, and she used to always say, like, why do they want me? Like, I've had a mission education. Like, and like, she was wise without even knowing it. And, she was so highly respected because she spoke her truth. And, I live by the mottos of lead by example. And like, if you say nothing, then you accept it. And if someone's saying something that I don't like, I need to be true to myself and actually go, well, no, sorry, I disagree. You can do things respectfully that way, and that just challenges the status quo. My elders and ancestors didn't get me to where I am today by not standing up, by accepting a no, or by not continuing to challenge the status quo. So, we've got to keep doing that to progress forward. And, always in the spirit of reconciliation. And, one of the questions that I always get asked is, we've come so far, haven't we, with reconciliation? Like, we're just, we're kicking goals. And I go, no, not really. Like, we haven't really moved forward. I think social media, computers have made it feel like we are moving quite fast and quite ahead. That's not the change that I see. The change that I see is actually focusing on the younger generations and empowering them. And I'll give you an example. So my now 18-year-old, when he was in kindergarten, he got called a nigger, right? Had no idea what the word meant. The kid that said it to him didn't understand it at all. He was just repeating it, and like, he went into this shell and like got really self-conscious, low self-esteem. And of course, Big Mama Bear comes in there and was like, like the school handled it incredibly well. And just 2 years ago, my nephew in the same school, same environment, he was in year 1, and he had this relief teacher from another country, and he's fair skin, white hair, and he's got a birthmark on his arm. And she said, oh, is that the part of you that's Aboriginal? And he was like, what? No, I'm Aboriginal everywhere, it's in my blood. And then just walked off and like went about his day, and that's the change that I see. I see that we've built our kids up, we've given them the correct and respectful words to be able to respond to that kind of racism and ridicule. And my goddaughter as well, God love her, she's 25 this year. She's the same, so once upon a time she experienced a lot of childhood trauma. She couldn't even be in the room where they were talking about it. Now she's a big vocalist for it and talks about everything, like, not that's happened to her, but what it actually meant. And we learn through our eyes. Kids learn through their eyes. So to see women on TV, to see, Auntie Agnes given a welcome, to see me given welcomes and sitting up here on panels, that's what the younger kids, and you can see them up there, that's what they're going to be like, oh yeah, like that's what I see is what we need to do and continue to do. And I think as women, it just comes naturally to us, like we just do it. Like, we're not whinging, we're actually, we've got a lot to say. We've got a big voice, and it's been silenced for too long. And yeah, look, in terms of reconciliation, there's still a long way to go. But, you know, as I said, we're headed in the right direction. And, you know, I find it, I do a lot of work with schools and kids, and, you know, like even my kids are getting in trouble for being on their phones. And I challenge the teachers and I go, you're on your phone the whole time. Like, we now use this in schools to be able to communicate and go, look, this kid's taken off there, like, that's okay. But they don't know that you're not on the games. They don't know that you're not on the social. All they see is an adult, you know, monkey see, monkey do on a phone. So until we can kind of lead by example, you know, and we grew up in an era when there was no technology and no phones, and we survived. I don't know how, but we survived. You know, I think that's where the change lies. And when we're talking about reconciliation and racism and stamping that out, it's the same. If you say nothing, then you accept it. We're all, you know, more attuned to racism and, you know, even that male misogynistic stuff. Like, we've got to start calling it out because we're all entitled to be able to stamp it out.
That is quite, and it's such a powerful words about the behaviour that you walk past becomes the behaviour that you accept. And that's a tenet that I think we all live by, to be able to have our voices be heard, because after all, you know, we are walking in the footsteps of giants. Now, colleagues, I also indicated that I did need to leave at 12, but before I do, I have one quick question to ask of all panellists, because I couldn't walk out of the room without actually knowing the answer to this question. So if I can ask everyone, please, let's try and keep it tight, because otherwise you'll see me running, and that's not anything that anyone needs to see. If you had one woman that you could pick out that's inspired you, who would that woman be?
Are you looking at
No, I'm going this way and I'm heading down.
All right, for me, that would be my Yolngu Yappa, Valerie Ganambar. I was adopted by Valerie into the Yolngu people of the Northeast Arnhem Land, into her clan and the Yunupingu family in Gunyangara, Northeast Arnhem Land, about 15 years ago. My latest book, Naku Daruk, is about the Yirrkala bark petitions and was written collaboratively with those people. When you walk out of this room, you'll hit the bark petitions there. Please notice that on the 12 signatories to that, 3 of those are women. So women have been involved in those very staunch political activities too. Valerie was the woman who has taught me the most, and I have a lot of historical heroes. But knowing Valerie over the last 15 years, Valerie is the woman who has taught me the most about courage and dignity and grace and trust and generosity and hospitality. We speak a couple of times every week, even though we're separated by the span of a nation. I've never known anybody who has worked so staunchly to defend her culture and her children, who are now my children. We share grandchildren together now as well. And she is who I think about every day when I think about the work that has to be done to continue to make this nation the sort of place that I want to live in.
Helen.
You said be brief, which is very tough. I will be brief though. I'll channel my inner tabloid journalist. 2 people, Turia Pitt, interviewed her a number of times. The latest interview I've just done came out yesterday on a podcast called Too Much, where she gives me a lot back. She gives me a lot of reflection on a lot of free advice, but 65% burns to her body. An athlete who went on to survive that, decades, years in hospital, multiple, I think 100 operations or something, completely unfathomable. 2 children, raised $100 million for charities. Like, has done the Hawaii marathon-y thing through the day and through the night, walked the Great Wall of China, done Kokoda. Never met anyone more exceptional than her. And when I interviewed her the other day, just tackles some amazing issues about being stopped at the shops and told she's brave for going out. And how she says the intention is good, but I'm not brave buying minced meat to make a lasagna. Second one, Jamila Rizvi, Deputy Managing Director of Future Women, 20 years younger than me. Talk to her every day, 3 or 4 times a day. One of the best advocates for women in the country, probably the leading voice of her generation. 2 brain tumours, lived through it, and bails me out every day.
Alison.
Well, I have sort of 2. So the first one is an artist called Mandy Martin, whose work is hanging behind us. Mandy taught me when I was at art school, when I was a very sort of naive young girl, and she was a huge influence on me. She taught me to have the courage in your convictions and in the potential of art to transform lives. She also taught me, which was a really important thing, which I've never really fully managed to grasp, but she tried to teach me not to be afraid of ambition, which is quite a thing for artists, I think. You know, you can be frightened. To think big, you know, like this work was a really major commission for a female artist. I remember she was talking about how she went to New York and she was in the Guggenheim Museum and some bloke said to her, "Oh, you paint like a man." But it's because she was ambitious and she had the strength of her own convictions that she could do this work. It was a really big role model for me to see that. And the other people for me was a bit like Clare. I had the privilege to live in the Northern Territory in a small dusty town called Tennant Creek for over a decade. It's 500 kilometres north of Alice Springs. And during that time I had the privilege of working with a group of Warramungu elders, mainly women, developing a new art and culture centre called Ninkonyunyu to describe the Warramungu story of the history of that town, which had previously been just told through white eyes as a gold mining thing. And those women, they told me in no uncertain time, I just remember the day so clearly, they said to me, "Nabulgari, we're going to lift you up," which was basically telling me that I was completely ignorant and I needed to be taught, which was just, but it was done with no judgment or rancour. It was just an act of generosity. And that has influenced the way I think about the way I work with young people or teaching, you know, lift people up.
Yes, I have 2 as well. The first one is obviously my grandmother. You know, seeing her up on stages and, you know, really big stages, you know, and like humbly saying, you know, my granddaughter Selena's here as well, like acknowledging me, made you feel so important. You know, also that, you know, it was her and Uncle Duncan that brought culture to Canberra. They're the 2 that started it. So she's my, and every day she's in my head. She's like, you know, don't pay them no mind, don't pay them no mind. You can only please half the people half the time. And the other one was actually, my memory is not that great, but it was one of my high school teachers, I think Fran Lankin her name was, and she was the Aboriginal teacher, and she, like, I remember she did clapsticks and she was trying to teach us to dance, and you know, at the time I was like, what is this woman doing? But you know, looking back now and reflecting, like that was my first exposure, which is why I do so much in the education space, to my own culture in a school setting. And, you know, she was a disruptor. Like she was doing something that no one else could do. And, you know, she was female as well, but she had the boys there, you know, and yeah, like, yeah, they're the two that come to mind, so yeah.
So I'm going to close off my particular part. I'm handing over to Erin now, who's going to be facilitating questions coming from the audience. Can I just say that this has been the highlight of my week, being able to meet and engage with, listen and learn from such amazing women. Passing over for audience participation, can I ask everyone give the panellists a bit of a clap for now? Lets me get off the stage.
Now I get to do karaoke. I've got a question for Helen, but first I hope Alison doesn't mind me telling a quick story. Now I'm going to be talking out of school. Alison was the head of print at ANU when I was a student, so I just want to say the thing that I remember all the time, sorry I've got autism and please don't look at me, was whenever you were teaching a lecture and showing slides of artists, I remember quite vividly you saying, these are all women because the men have had their time and I'm not interested in showing you any more of that, so thank you. And also lifting up from Mandy to you, and then now I get to do it as well, so I really appreciate you being in my life. Helen, you mentioned Professor Ryan's term, glass cliff. I wonder if you wouldn't mind expanding on what that means, please.
Absolutely. And thank you for the question. I think it was, it's 10 years old, that research. She was in the UK, so entirely data-led. And what it means is she looked at the data and could see these women getting these great jobs, like, oh, good, gets the job, but only ever at the point where the organisation or the country or the state was in absolute turmoil. So it was at the point where the men go, So the first example from my recollection of this research was Joan Kerner. Was always a great example of, it was at that point, no one's really going to run for leader of the Labor Party at that point. Oh yes, perfect, give it to a woman, she'll be sensible, fix it. And you know, it didn't end brilliantly for her, but the circumstances were loaded against her. So that was sort of the first example, but I just think you see it over and over and over again now, where the men kind of go, that's not the time to do that job, it's not really going to be good for my career, and women are seen as the safe pair of hands or the surprise, where everyone else is like not on the park. That it was that phenomenon. And so you look at Qantas is just the contemporary example. Alan Joyce, Chairman's Lounge, a whole book on it. And there was a lot leading up to what went wrong under Alan Joyce at that point. He steps down, board's in turmoil. Guess what? 2 women are candidates. Vanessa Hudson and Olivia Wirth. Classic case of a glass cliff. Now, Vanessa Hudson, I think, is doing a really good job by all accounts to date, but she's been loaded with a company that has had underinvestment in planes for a long time, customer dissatisfaction ratings off the scale, a whole bunch of remuneration issues with the previous CEO. I mean, it's just loaded against her. So it means when you get tapped on the shoulder to do the job that no man really wants. Now, just to finish that, Professor Ryan's point on this is, if you are ever a glass cliff candidate, what do you do? And I think this is a really interesting question, because it's going to happen, to women everywhere all the time. Is know that. If you can see that and you know what the circumstances are, then if you frame it before you take the job and say, well, I know I am the glass cliff candidate, and you frame your KPIs or your sense of what's achievable in that context, not the context that they want to frame it for you, and go in eyes wide open, because it can work very well for you. But in many examples, if you're the glass cliff candidate, it reinforces the stereotype that women can't handle, can't lead, aren't good candidates. It's a failure. Go back to the bloke who sat that round out nice and quietly and turns up for the job when most of the mess is kind of past.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? I'm sure there's plenty. Be great.
Thank you. Hi. Sorry, I'm just trying to form my question in my head as well. Selena, you talked about we're ready for truth listening now, and a lot of the topics we're talking about today, I think in here it feels like that safe place where we can discuss the things that we're up against. But when we're out there and you're trying to have these conversations with, let's say, the men in your lives, or, you're up against, I guess, patriarchy, and can be met with, I guess, insult for advocating for what you believe in and for advocating for women. How do you sustain yourself? How do you rebuild, fuel yourself and just sort of keep going?
Pet therapy works. So I have four cats, 3 dogs, 4 birds. I just keep remembering what my grandmother said. Like we as blackfellas do have a lot of intergenerational trauma, but we have a lot more intergenerational resilience. And I just keep the goal in mind. Like when you go out on a football field, and I'm a rugby league fan, Eagles and Queensland, you don't go out there like worried that you're going to get hit or worried that you're not going to win. You go out there with the intention to do the best that you can and to reach the goal, right? And you do that with a team. And we're humans. We need that village around us, and we choose who we have, in our team. And so we need to choose wisely first of all, but also draw on them. Like there's also this pressure of if you're a leader, then you've got to do it all on your own. No, we don't. That's not how we as humans actually get through. And yeah, just be true to yourself and acknowledge it's tough.
Can I draw on that? I couldn't agree more. And I think one of the things that often happens on a day like International Women's Day is that we do celebrate the heroes, and we choose out individuals who have made an incredible contribution. But none of those women who are on Alison's wall out there did that alone. And I think collective action is 100% the most important thing that we have, that strength in numbers and drawing on the energy of our fellow women. And I also would like to acknowledge the other thing that happens on International Women's Day is we get very binary about gender. But there will be people in this room who were either AFAB, assigned female at birth, but who identify as non-binary or even trans women. And we know that, again, those are the people whose rights are most under attack now and will continue to be under attack. And we have to support everybody and bring them along. So I would say things like trust your anger. If you're angry about something, it's likely there are other people in the room that are angry about it too. stand in your truth and stand in your power. Like, these sound like Instagram memes, but these are the things that I have learnt. I turned 56 this year. I think once you're over 50 and the hourglass, the sands are kind of running the opposite direction, you've got no time for the kind of people pleasing or the being nice or the waiting to the right time to say something or the not stepping on toes. You recognise you've only got a certain amount of time left, and if you're not going to speak to your true voice, sorry for the men in the room, if your marriage isn't working anymore, even after 35 years, it was in my situation, I left it because it was not, because I couldn't be true to myself, I couldn't be authentic within it, and that, you know, you take hits along the way for it, but at the end of the day, you just have your voice, but your voice combined with the other voices in the room is what will give you true power and true strength.
I can't help jumping in on this one as well. I think there's some really excellent points there about just going and finding others who feel similar to you, just sounding that out, see whether you've got a bit more of a gang to give you some emotional courage or support. So that would be one thing to think about. I'd spent a lot of time in this space about how to frame the argument and the conversation. So I'm thinking in real time, like you're in the moment, and I can see in your face this is kind of what your challenge is. I think there's worth taking some time to doing some reading and thinking about how you frame the argument. You've heard a bit of us talk about data and history. They can be useful. I've got a team member she's 30, she's a rock star in this space. She's on a number of panels today. And I just sent her a note saying good luck today. But she's very good, particularly when there's a generational difference. So I sometimes fall into the generational difference. A little bit of the, seriously, you know, it wasn't like that in my day, get over yourself. I mean, I'm not that bad, but there's a little bit of that in my generation. And she's very good at sort of saying, just sort of challenging me in this sort of way, but have you thought about it this way? What about the people that it affects this way? Just kind of finding that language space when it's really uncomfortable. Language can really make a difference. So I'm trying to give you like day-to-day insights, and I think you can do it in a way that, one of the challenges is men particularly, and women who are not as informed on this stuff, you can get instantly defensive. And before you know it, you're in a fight that you didn't plan to have. And I think trying to avoid that scenario with language.
On the flip side,
yep.
Julia Gillard and the misogyny speech.
Yeah, oh yeah.
I mean, I'm a girly swat from way back, so I would also, you know, do my research, get my facts straight, bolster my shaky opinion with a whole bunch of evidence. But the reason she cut through with that it was passion. Yeah. And the reason that went viral and millions of women related to it was because she spoke off the cuff. Yep. And she just did trust her anger in that moment and spoke to it.
Yeah, she had months or years of build-up to that point.
And it was what a lot of women wanted to say themselves.
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I'll never forget that day.
No, me neither.
No.
I'll never forget it.
And it was on in my office, and I just turned around and then turned up and then said to the whole team, come and watch this.
Yeah, yeah.
It was a moment. Absolutely, go for it too.
Yeah.
But if you're looking for day-to-day things, you know, try a few different, I feel for you.
I've always found gang warfare work.
Or guerrilla warfare.
And if all else fails, retail therapy.
Leave your job, go somewhere else.
Or ring me for Black Up and I'll be there, all right?
There you go.
There are many options available. Now, we have time for one more question. So is there anyone with a burning question down right
now? Thank you to you all for coming today. We noted the gender pay gap statistics that were released on Monday. I noted that one of the brands with the biggest gender pay gap at about 67% was City Chick, and as a fat queer woman, that was pretty shocking to know that the CEO was paid significantly more. I just wondered if we could touch on maybe why men are so successful at marketing products to women and why we reward them for doing so.
It's sort of the same one-word answer that when people say, why have women been left out of history? You can give the long answer or you can give the one-word answer, which is patriarchy. And it's just really, really good at regenerating itself over and over again. And then you add patriarchy, you twin it with capitalism. And, you know, it's an extraordinary formula for success, and all we can do is resist it in all the moments that we can. And even you just identifying yourself as you did at the beginning of that question, that's a moment of resistance, and it's not brave, it's making lasagna, but thank you for doing so.
I'm going to go to the practical on this one as well, and just say what I'd love to see more women or gender diverse people do is take the time to work out how an organisation runs, where the money is. Too often we get pushed, and I'm going to use my magazine experience. You're an editor, you don't need to know whether the magazine's making any money, and they would just not tell me. I just wouldn't have any access to the P&L. And that's a very dangerous place to be for anyone. It's a really dangerous place for a woman to be. And mostly men aren't left out of the P&L. It is not complicated. Finances are not that hard. You can write a book, you can work out what money's coming in and what money's going out. So I just say to women, just get across the basics of the finances, because it sets you up to run those companies. And that's the problem. We've kind of been kept away for all patriarchy reasons or whatever reasons you want to identify, but we've sort of stayed away from the money. And if you know where the money's coming from, it gives you an extra range of power.
Great point.
I'll just say to stay strong and solid in your identity. You just do you, you know. I'm a big kid, and like even sitting up here with these amazing people, like I feel like a fraud. You know, I've got my Air Forces on, I've got my, you know, Disney handbag, this is the first handbag. The second one, sorry, the other one was Mickey Mouse that I've owned, like, and that's only in the past 3 years because I felt like I'm 44, I probably should grow up and get a bag, so this is it. And the reason that I do that is so that all the kids that see me up on stage, talking, you know, they feel they can be themselves. Because when we are not ourselves, we are not confident, we are not, you know, we don't have that self-esteem. And, you know, even just the 3 questions from the ladies, like, in the room that asked it, you were talking, like, really, really softly. Like, hell no, you talk loud and proud in everything that you do. Because that's what actually other people see and other people respect. And let me tell you, it took me a bloody long time to find my voice. Yeah. A very, very long time. And, you know, one of my high school teachers is actually in the room. And, you know, all my high school teachers can attest that I was the one hiding. I was not talking. I was petrified of public speaking. And it was my grandmother that kept pushing me, you know, training me up to take over from her. And, you know, it was only after she died that I was like, oh God, I've got to find my own voice now, because, you know, even though I was the big neck, she was the wise one, now I've got to be both. And, you know, no one's ready for leadership. I didn't grow up going, oh, yep, I'm going to be a leader. Yeah. You know, we just do it naturally because we are women and we are everything. So, you know, just little things like that. Like, you know, I always tell my kids, and I've got king care of 9 teenagers, and 7 of them are boys. No, 6 of them are boys. And I still challenge them now to, you know, when that's like, oh, you run like a girl, and I go, I'm a girl. I don't run like that. And they're like, yeah, like we've still got to shift that out of they don't understand what they're saying. They're just repeating what they're saying. But if we say nothing, then we accept it. And so, you know, and when I talk to them with authority, because that is not okay, and I'm not going to stand for that disrespect. So when you're talking, talk loud. Like, I know it's hard. You will find your voice in your own time when you are meant to, but start to practice it.
That was a fantastic end to what has been a really interesting and very insightful discussion. I know that each of you will have taken away your own pieces of the conversation that stuck with you. But I am very much looking forward to working into my dialect about not getting sucked into a sinkhole of suckery. Yeah. And I think it's really important, the note that you made, Alison, about not being afraid of ambition. So for myself, they're the ones I'm going to take away. Can we please have an enormous round of applause for our panel? Now, just before we break, I am going to refer to the notes on my phone because there are a couple of important things that I need to get out and I need to make sure I don't miss any of the core information. So, in celebration of International Women's Day here at Australian Parliament House, we are holding a Women in Parliament tour over the next week. The QR code will appear on the side screens momentarily, and you can use the QR code to book your tickets. Now, the tour explores the stories of women who have shaped Australian parliamentary democracy, and the tour will start from tomorrow through to next Wednesday, and it leaves at 11 a.m. every day. So please take the opportunity to get on that tour. Lastly, events like these might only run for 2 hours in their entirety, but they take hours and months of pre-planning and preparation. Working tirelessly behind the scenes have been the members of the International Women's Day Working Group, and I would like you to give a massive round of applause to all the women who have brought this event together today for you. And then lastly, we would like to invite you to join us for refreshments and cupcakes. You can also come up and have photos. Some of our panel members will hopefully be staying around to field any more of your questions for the next half hour. Please also, if any of your colleagues wanted to be here today but were unable to attend, take a cupcake and celebrate International Women's Day with them back at the office. Thank you very much.